Picture this, a solemn funeral service, mourners dressed in black, tears flowing freely, and then, suddenly, chaos. A small dog leaps onto a coffin, and what happens next becomes one of the most talked about moments in rock and roll history. This isn't just another celebrity story. It's a tale that reveals the raw, unfiltered humanity behind one of music's most controversial figures. When most people think of Ozzy Osbourne, they imagine the wild antics, the biting of bat heads, the outrageous stage performances. But what happened on that quiet Tuesday afternoon in a small English cemetery showed a different side of the Prince of Darkness, one that would leave witnesses questioning everything they thought they knew about grief, love, and the unbreakable bonds between humans and their four-legged companions. This is the true story of how a simple act by a beloved pet transformed a moment of profound sorrow into something extraordinary, reminding everyone present that sometimes the most powerful gestures come from the most unexpected sources. What unfolded that day wasn't just about a dog jumping on a coffin. It was about loyalty, loss, and the kind of love that transcends death itself. Get ready to discover how one small creature's instinctive action created a moment so powerful, so deeply moving, that it would be whispered about in music circles for decades to come. The year was 1982, and Ozzy Osbourne's life was spinning faster than a record on a turntable. Fresh from his departure from Black Sabbath, he was carving out his solo career with the kind of intensity that had made him a legend. His debut album, Blizzard of Oz, had taken the world by storm, and his follow-up, Diary of a Madman, was climbing the charts like a bat out of hell. But behind the screaming fans and sold-out arenas, there was a quieter story unfolding in the Osbourne household, one that involved an unlikely friendship that would soon capture the hearts of everyone who witnessed it. The dog had arrived on a rainy Thursday evening in November. Ozzy's wife Sharon had found the small terrier mix wandering the streets near their home in Buckinghamshire, soaked to the bone and clearly abandoned. The little creature was nothing like what you'd expect to find in the home of heavy metal royalty. No massive German Shepherd or intimidating Rottweiler, just a scruffy, medium-sized mutt with mismatched ears and eyes that seemed to hold more wisdom than his size suggested. "What are we going to do with him?" Sharon had asked, toweling off the shivering animal in their kitchen. Ozzy, who was taking a rare break between tour legs, looked down at the dog and felt something stir in his chest. Maybe it was the way the little guy looked up at him without fear, or perhaps it was the timing, arriving just when Ozzy needed something real and uncomplicated in his increasingly chaotic world. "He stays," Ozzy said simply, and that was that. They named him Rudy, after the song Rude Boy that had been playing on the radio when they found him. From that moment on, Rudy became Ozzy's shadow, following him everywhere with a devotion that amazed everyone who saw them together. The bond between Ozzy and Rudy defied explanation. Here was a man known for his wild behavior, his unpredictable outbursts, and his legendary consumption of alcohol and drugs. And yet with this small dog, he showed a gentleness that few people ever witnessed. Rudy didn't care about Ozzy's reputation or his fame. To the dog, Ozzy was simply the human who had given him a home, and that was worth everything. During recording sessions for his third album, Rudy would curl up in the corner of the studio, content to wait for hours while Ozzy worked. The other musicians and producers initially found it amusing to see this small dog in such a serious musical environment, but they quickly grew to love having him around. Rudy had a calming effect on everyone, but especially on Ozzy, who seemed more focused and peaceful when his four-legged friend was nearby. "That dog understands him in a way the rest of us never could," observed guitarist Randy Rhoads during one late-night recording session. "Watch them together sometime. It's like they're speaking their own language." And it was true. Ozzy would talk to Rudy constantly, sharing his thoughts and frustrations with the patient animal who never judged, never criticized, and never asked for anything more than the occasional belly rub and a warm place to sleep. The relationship wasn't just one-sided. Rudy seemed to have an almost supernatural ability to sense Ozzy's moods and needs. When Ozzy was struggling with the pressures of fame or dealing with the demons that had always haunted him, Rudy would appear at his side, offering silent comfort. During Ozzy's darker moments, and there were many, The dog's presence served as an anchor, keeping him grounded when everything else felt like it was spinning out of control. Tour life could have been difficult for a pet, but Rudy adapted with the same easy grace that had marked his entry into the Osbourne household. He traveled in the tour bus, sleeping in Ozzy's bunk or on the small couch that became his designated spot. The crew members, initially skeptical about having a dog on the road, soon became as protective of Rudy as they were of their equipment. The little terrier had a way of making everyone feel more human, more connected to something beyond the madness of rock and roll. In hotels across America and Europe, Rudy would explore new rooms with the curiosity of a seasoned traveler, always returning to Ozzy's side when it was time to settle down. Hotel staff often commented on how well-behaved the dog was, and how different Ozzy seemed when Rudy was with him. The usual demands and complaints that came with hosting rock stars were noticeably absent. Instead, they saw a man who was genuinely concerned about his pet's comfort and well-being. Back home in England, Rudy had claimed his territory throughout the Osbourne house. He had a favorite spot by the fireplace where he would lie while Ozzy worked on new songs at the piano. He knew which rooms were off-limits and which family members were most likely to share their dinner. But his loyalty remained unwavering. When Ozzy left, even for a quick trip to the store, Rudy would position himself by the door to wait for his return. The media, always hungry for stories about the Prince of Darkness, began to take notice of Ozzy's unusual companion. Photographers captured images of them walking together through the countryside, Rudy trotting beside Ozzy like a small, furry bodyguard. These photos showed a side of Ozzy that contrasted sharply with his public persona. Here was a man who clearly loved and cared for something beyond himself. Interviews from that period often included mentions of Rudy, and Ozzy's face would light up whenever he talked about his dog. "He's the most honest friend I've ever had," he told one journalist. "Dogs don't lie to you. They don't want anything from you except love, and they give it back 10 times over. Rudy's taught me more about loyalty than any human ever could." As 1982 moved into 1983, the bond between Ozzy and Rudy only grew stronger. The dog had become an integral part of not just Ozzy's life, but the entire family dynamic. Sharon loved watching her husband interact with Rudy, seeing a tenderness that reminded her why she had fallen in love with him in the first place. Their children, Kelly and Jack, grew up thinking it was perfectly normal to have a dog who traveled the world with their father and slept on hotel beds in five-star establishments. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about Rudy was his ability to sense when Ozzy needed him most. During particularly difficult recording sessions or stressful business meetings, the dog would somehow find his way to Ozzy's side, offering the kind of support that no amount of money or success could buy. It was as if Rudy understood that his human needed him to be more than just a pet. He needed to be a friend, a confidant, and sometimes a lifeline. Friends and family members often remarked on how Rudy had changed Ozzy. The wild unpredictability that had characterized so much of his behavior seemed to mellow when the dog was around. Not that Ozzy became tame. He was still the same passionate, intense performer who could command a stage like no one else. But there was a new stability in his personal life, a center of calm that seemed to emanate from his relationship with his four-legged companion. The music industry is not known for lasting relationships or genuine loyalty, but what Ozzy and Rudy shared was different. It was pure, uncomplicated love, the kind that doesn't need contracts or negotiations or promises of future benefits. It simply existed, strong and true, forming the foundation for what would become one of the most moving stories in rock and roll history. What neither Ozzy nor anyone else could have known was that their time together was about to be tested in a way that would reveal the true depth of their extraordinary bond. The first signs that something was wrong came on a crisp autumn morning in October 1983. Rudy, who had always been the first to greet each new day with enthusiastic tail wagging and eager eyes, seemed unusually sluggish. He moved more slowly than usual, and his normally bright eyes appeared dim and unfocused. Ozzy, who had developed an almost telepathic connection with his companion, noticed the change immediately. "He's just getting older," Sharon suggested when Ozzy expressed his concerns. Rudy was approaching his 7th birthday, not old for a dog his size, but certainly past the puppy stage that had defined his early days with the family. Still, something nagged at Ozzy. In all the time they had spent together, through countless miles of touring and the stress of recording sessions, Rudy had never seemed anything less than completely vital and engaged with the world around him. The Osbourne family was preparing for another major tour, this one to support Ozzy's latest album, Bark at the Moon. The elaborate stage production required months of planning, and Ozzy was deeply involved in every detail. But even as he worked on choreography and discussed lighting designs, his attention kept drifting to Rudy, who seemed to be spending more time sleeping and less time following Ozzy around the house. Dr. Margaret Walsh had been the Osbourne family veterinarian for several years, and she had watched Rudy grow from the scraggly stray that Sharon had rescued into the confident, well-loved companion he had become. When Ozzy brought Rudy in for what he hoped would be a routine checkup, Dr. Walsh's expression grew serious as she conducted her examination. "I'd like to run some additional tests," she said carefully, her hands gentle as she felt along Rudy's abdomen. "There are some irregularities I want to investigate further." The words hung in the air like a discordant note in an otherwise perfect song. Ozzy felt his heart sink, but he tried to maintain his composure for Rudy's sake. Animals could sense fear and anxiety, and the last thing he wanted was to make his friend more uncomfortable than he already was. The tests took 3 agonizing days to complete. During that time, Ozzy found himself watching Rudy with the intensity of a scientist studying a rare specimen. Every breath, every movement, every expression was analyzed and cataloged. He canceled meetings and postponed rehearsals, unwilling to leave Rudy's side for more than a few minutes at a time. His management team grew frustrated, but Sharon understood. She had seen the depth of connection between her husband and their dog, and she knew that nothing else mattered until they had answers. When Dr. Walsh called with the results, her voice was gentle but clear. Rudy had developed a rare form of cancer that was aggressive and had already spread throughout his small body. The prognosis was not good. Weeks, perhaps a month or 2 at most, depending on how quickly the disease progressed. Treatment options were limited and would likely cause more suffering than relief. Ozzy listened to the diagnosis in stunned silence, the phone heavy in his hand. He had faced many challenges in his life, from his struggles with addiction to the pressures of fame, but nothing had prepared him for this. The idea of losing Rudy, his constant companion, his most loyal friend, seemed impossible to comprehend. How could something so full of life, so essentially present in every moment, simply fade away? The conversation with Dr. Walsh continued, but Ozzy barely heard the technical details about the type of cancer or the progression timeline. All he could focus on was the certainty that his time with Rudy was now measured in days rather than years. When he finally hung up the phone, he sat in silence for a long time, trying to process what he had just learned. Sharon found him an hour later, still sitting in the same chair, staring at nothing. "What did she say?" she asked, though she already knew from his expression that the news was not good. When Ozzy told her about Rudy's diagnosis, she felt her own heart break, not just for the dog she had grown to love, but for her husband, who she knew would be devastated by this loss. The decision of how to handle Rudy's final weeks was not an easy one. Dr. Walsh had explained that the dog was not in significant pain yet, and that his quality of life was still relatively good. They could make him comfortable and allow him to spend his remaining time in familiar surroundings, surrounded by the people he loved. It was a small comfort, but Ozzy clung to it desperately. Rudy himself seemed unaware that anything had fundamentally changed. He continued his daily routines with the same quiet dignity that had always characterized his approach to life. He still followed Ozzy from room to room, though his steps were slower and he needed more frequent rest stops. He still claimed his favorite spot by the fireplace, though he spent more time sleeping than watching the flames dance behind the glass. Ozzy's behavior during those weeks revealed depths of tenderness that even Sharon had rarely seen. He canceled the upcoming tour, despite the enormous financial implications and the disappointment it would cause thousands of fans. When his management team protested, Ozzy's response was simple and non-negotiable. "Rudy needs me now. Everything else can wait." He spent hours each day simply sitting with Rudy, talking to him in the soft voice he reserved only for his four-legged friend. Sometimes he would read aloud from books or newspapers, as if the sound of his voice could somehow slow the progression of the disease. Other times he would play gentle music on his acoustic guitar, songs that seemed to soothe both himself and his dying companion. The other members of the Osbourne household, family, friends, and staff, watched this tender vigil with a mixture of admiration and heartbreak. They saw a man who was known worldwide for his wild behavior and unpredictable antics transformed into the most devoted caregiver imaginable. Ozzy monitored Rudy's eating habits, made sure he had the most comfortable bedding, and even slept on the floor beside the dog's bed to be close if he was needed during the night. As the weeks passed, Rudy's condition gradually worsened. The energetic dog who had once bounded through hotel lobbies and explored new cities with enthusiasm now struggled to make it to his food bowl without assistance. His breathing became more labored, and his once bright eyes began to lose their spark. Dr. Walsh made regular house calls, adjusting his medication and providing guidance on keeping him comfortable, but they all knew they were fighting a losing battle. The hardest part for Ozzy was watching Rudy try to maintain his normal behavior despite his obvious discomfort. The dog's loyalty remained unchanged. He still attempted to follow Ozzy around the house, even when walking was clearly difficult. He still tried to greet visitors with his characteristic tail wag, though the gesture was now barely visible. It was as if Rudy was determined to remain the same faithful companion he had always been, regardless of how his body was betraying him. During these final weeks, Ozzy found himself having conversations with Rudy that were more honest and open than many he had ever had with human beings. He talked about his fears, his regrets, and his gratitude for the unconditional love that Rudy had brought into his life. He apologized for the times he had been too busy to pay attention, for the occasions when tour schedules had kept them apart, for any moment when he might have taken their friendship for granted. Friends and family members who witnessed these conversations were struck by their intimacy and authenticity. Here was a man who performed for millions of people around the world, but who was most himself when talking to a small, sick dog who couldn't answer back. The conversations revealed not just Ozzy's love for Rudy, but also his deep understanding of what their relationship had meant to both of them. As November turned into December, it became clear that Rudy's time was running out. Dr. Walsh gently suggested that they might want to consider helping him pass peacefully before his suffering became too great. The decision would be one of the most difficult Ozzy had ever faced, but he knew that his love for Rudy meant putting the dog's comfort above his own desire to keep his friend with him for as long as possible. The conversation about end-of-life decisions was heartbreaking for everyone involved. Ozzy wanted to do right by Rudy, but the thought of actively choosing to say goodbye felt impossible to bear. How could he make such a decision for someone he loved so much? How could he choose the moment when their extraordinary friendship would come to an end? These questions haunted him as December progressed, and Rudy's condition continued to decline. What Ozzy didn't know was that Rudy would make the decision for him. On a quiet Tuesday morning in mid-December, with the first snow of winter beginning to fall outside their windows, Rudy passed away peacefully in his sleep, curled up in his favorite spot by the fireplace. Ozzy found him there when he came downstairs to start what he thought would be another day of caring for his sick friend, but instead became the day he had to say his final goodbye. The silence in the house that morning was unlike anything the Osbourne family had ever experienced. Rudy had been such a constant presence, such an integral part of their daily lives, that his absence seemed to echo through every room. Ozzy sat beside his friend's still form for hours, unable to quite believe that their journey together had come to an end. The dog who had transformed his understanding of loyalty and love was gone, leaving behind memories that would last a lifetime and a grief that felt almost too heavy to bear. The morning after Rudy's death, Ozzy sat in his study, surrounded by an almost overwhelming silence. The house felt different without the soft padding of four paws on the hardwood floors, without the gentle jingling of a collar, without the reassuring presence that had become such a fundamental part of his daily existence. Sharon found him there as the sun was beginning to rise, staring out the window at nothing in particular, his face a mask of grief that she had never seen before. "We need to make arrangements," she said gently. settling into the chair beside him. It was a practical consideration, but one that needed to be addressed. They couldn't simply ignore what had happened or pretend that Rudy's body could remain indefinitely in the house where he had lived so happily. The reality of death demanded action, even when action was the last thing anyone wanted to think about. Ozzy nodded slowly, understanding the necessity but feeling completely unprepared for the decisions that lay ahead. How do you say goodbye to someone who had been such an integral part of your life? How do you honor a relationship that had meant everything to you, even though the rest of the world might see it as just the bond between a man and his dog? These questions had no easy answers, but they demanded responses nonetheless. The first call was to Dr. Walsh, who expressed her condolences and offered to handle the initial arrangements. She had seen the bond between Ozzy and Rudy during their visits to her clinic, and she understood that this was far more than the routine loss of a family pet. Her gentle professionalism was exactly what the family needed during those first difficult hours of planning. Many families choose cremation, Dr. Walsh explained during their phone conversation. It allows you to keep him close, in a way. But there are other options if you prefer something different. She mentioned pet cemeteries and memorial gardens, places specifically designed to provide dignified resting places for beloved animals. The conversation was clinical by necessity, but her voice carried the warmth of someone who truly understood the depth of human-animal bonds. Ozzy found himself unable to make these decisions immediately. The idea of cremation seemed too final, too much like erasing Rudy's physical presence from the world. But burial in a pet cemetery felt somehow insufficient for someone who had meant so much to him. Rudy hadn't been just any dog. He had been a friend, a companion, a source of comfort during some of life's most difficult moments. He deserved something special, something that reflected the unique place he had held in the Osbourne family. As the day progressed, friends and family members began to arrive at the house. Word of Rudy's death had spread quietly through their circle, and people came to offer condolences and support. Many of them had their own memories of the little terrier, stories of his travels with the band, his calm presence during stressful recording sessions, his ability to make even the most jaded music industry professionals smile. Randy Rhoads, Ozzy's guitarist and close friend, arrived that afternoon with tears in his eyes. "That dog saved your life more than once," he told Ozzy simply. "He kept you grounded when nothing else could." It was a sentiment that many others would echo in the days that followed. The recognition that Rudy had provided something irreplaceable in Ozzy's life, something that went far beyond simple companionship. The stories that emerged during these conversations painted a picture of a dog who had touched many lives. Crew members remembered how Rudy would greet them each morning on tour, his tail wagging with the enthusiasm of someone genuinely happy to see friends. Hotel staff recalled his perfect behavior and the way he seemed to sense which people needed comfort. Even strangers on the street had been charmed by his friendly demeanor and the obvious love between him and his famous owner. By evening, an idea had begun to form in Ozzy's mind. Rudy had lived an extraordinary life, traveling the world and experiencing things that few dogs ever would. He had been more than a pet. He had been a member of the family, a friend to everyone who met him, a source of joy and comfort to countless people. Perhaps his final goodbye should reflect that uniqueness. "I want him to have a proper funeral," Ozzy announced to Sharon and the small group of close friends who had gathered in their living room. The statement was met with surprised silence at first, then nods of understanding. Of course Rudy deserved a proper send-off. Of course his death should be marked with the same dignity and respect that would be given to any beloved family member. The planning began immediately. They would hold a service at the small chapel in the nearby village where the Osbourne family occasionally attended services. The vicar, Father Michael Harrison, was initially hesitant when Sharon called to make the request. A funeral service for a dog was certainly unusual, but when she explained who Rudy had been to their family, he agreed to help them create something appropriate and meaningful. "All of God's creatures deserve to be honored," Father Harrison said when they met to discuss the details. "If this dog brought love and comfort into your lives, then celebrating that gift is entirely appropriate." His understanding and compassion made the planning process easier, giving them confidence that they were making the right choice. The guest list grew organically as word spread. Band members, crew, family friends, and even some local villagers who had encountered Rudy during his walks through the countryside asked if they could attend. It became clear that this small dog had touched more lives than anyone had fully realized. Each person had their own story about Rudy, their own memory of how he had made them smile or provided comfort during a difficult moment. Sharon took charge of the practical arrangements, understanding that Ozzy was too grief-stricken to handle the details himself. She contacted a local funeral director who, though surprised by the nature of the service, agreed to help them create something dignified and appropriate. They arranged for a small, beautiful casket made of polished wood, lined with soft fabric that matched Rudy's favorite blanket. The flowers were carefully chosen to reflect Rudy's personality and the joy he had brought to their lives. Instead of the traditional funeral arrangements of lilies and roses, they selected cheerful daisies, bright sunflowers, and wildflowers that reminded everyone of the countryside walks that Rudy had loved so much. The arrangements were colorful and life-affirming, a celebration rather than just a mourning. Music was another important consideration. Ozzy wanted something that reflected both his own musical background and Rudy's gentle spirit. They chose a mix of classical pieces and soft acoustic songs, music that would create an atmosphere of peace and reflection. Ozzy even considered performing something himself, though he wasn't sure if his emotions would allow him to get through a song without breaking down. The most difficult decision was what to say during the service. How do you eulogize a dog without sounding foolish? How do you express the depth of feeling for someone who couldn't speak but had communicated so much through actions and presence? Ozzy struggled with these questions for hours, sitting at his piano and trying to find words that could capture what Rudy had meant to him. In the end, he decided to speak from the heart, to simply tell the truth about their friendship and what it had taught him. He would talk about loyalty and unconditional love, about the way Rudy had made him a better person, about the countless moments of joy and comfort that his four-legged friend had provided. The words didn't have to be perfect, they just had to be honest. The evening before the funeral, Ozzy spent time alone with Rudy's body, which had been carefully prepared and placed in the beautiful casket. The little dog looked peaceful, as if he were simply sleeping after a long day of adventures. Ozzy talked to him quietly, sharing final thoughts and memories, expressing his gratitude for all the happiness Rudy had brought into his life. "You were the best friend I ever had," he whispered, his voice breaking with emotion. "You never asked for anything except love, and you gave back more than I ever deserved. I don't know how I'm going to do this without you, but I promise I'll never forget what you taught me about being human." The conversation was one-sided now, but somehow it still felt like communication, as if Rudy's spirit was listening and understanding. As the night wore on, other family members came to pay their respects. Kelly and Jack, Ozzy's children, said their own goodbyes to the dog who had been a constant presence throughout their childhood. Sharon placed a small toy in the casket, Rudy's favorite squeaky ball that had traveled with them around the world. Each gesture was simple but meaningful, a way of honoring the relationship they had all shared with this special animal. The morning of the funeral dawned gray and cloudy, with a light mist hanging over the countryside. It seemed appropriate somehow, not sunny and cheerful, but not devastatingly dark either. Just a quiet, subdued day that matched the mood of everyone who would be gathering to say goodbye. The chapel had been decorated with the flowers they had chosen, and the casket was positioned at the front, surrounded by photographs of Rudy from throughout his life with the Osbourne family. As people began to arrive, it became clear that this would be unlike any funeral service any of them had ever attended. The gathering was an unusual mix of rock stars and local villagers, music industry executives, and childhood friends, all united by their connection to a small dog who had somehow managed to touch all of their lives. The atmosphere was one of genuine affection and respect, proof that love and grief are universal emotions that transcend species barriers. Father Harrison greeted each arrival personally, his warm smile and gentle manner helping to put everyone at ease. This was new territory for him as well, but his genuine care for the Osbourne family and his understanding of the significance of this loss made him the perfect person to guide them through this unique service. Everything was ready. All that remained was to say goodbye. The small chapel of St. Mary's had never hosted a service quite like this one. As mourners filed in on that gray December morning, the atmosphere was unlike anything the centuries-old building had witnessed. Rock stars with leather jackets sat beside elderly villagers in their Sunday best. Music industry executives checked their emotions alongside local farmers who had known Rudy from his countryside walks. The common thread binding this unusual congregation was genuine grief for a small dog who had somehow managed to touch all of their lives. Father Harrison stood at the altar, his usually confident demeanor showing just a hint of uncertainty. In his 30 years of ministry, he had conducted hundreds of funeral services, but none for a four-legged congregant. Still, as he looked out at the faces before him, faces marked by real sorrow and genuine love, he understood that this service was about something much larger than species boundaries. It was about honoring a relationship that had brought joy, comfort, and meaning to many lives. Ozzy sat in the front pew beside Sharon, his face a mask of barely controlled emotion. He had barely slept the night before, alternating between memories of his years with Rudy and anxiety about whether he would be able to get through the service without completely breaking down. The casket before him, surrounded by colorful flowers and photographs, seemed impossibly small to contain something that had been such a huge presence in his life. The service began with a piece of classical music that Rudy had always seemed to enjoy during quiet evenings at home. As the gentle melody filled the chapel, many in the congregation found themselves transported back to their own memories of the little terrier. Randy Rhoads remembered Rudy sleeping peacefully in the corner of recording studios while the band worked through complex arrangements. Sharon recalled countless mornings when she had found Ozzy and Rudy sharing breakfast, the dog sitting patiently beside his master's chair waiting for the occasional treat. Father Harrison's opening words were carefully chosen to acknowledge the unusual nature of the gathering while respecting the genuine grief that filled the room. We gather today not to mourn the passing of a pet, but to celebrate the life of a friend, he began. Rudy brought something precious into this world, the gift of unconditional love, unwavering loyalty, and simple joy in everyday moments. These are qualities that all of us, regardless of species, can aspire to embody. The first reading was done by Tommy Aldridge, Ozzy's drummer, who had traveled with Rudy on countless tours. His voice shook slightly as he read from a passage about faithful companionship, the words carrying extra weight because of his personal knowledge of the bond between Ozzy and his dog. Tommy remembered nights on the tour bus when Rudy would move from bunk to bunk, checking on each band member like a furry tour manager, making sure everyone was settled for the night. When it came time for personal remembrances, the stories that emerged painted a picture of a dog who had been far more than just a pet. Bob Daisley, the bass player who had worked closely with Ozzy on several albums, spoke about Rudy's uncanny ability to sense tension in the studio and somehow defuse it with his mere presence. He was like a four-legged therapist, Bob said with a sad smile. Whenever things got heated during recording sessions, Rudy would just walk over to whoever was most stressed and sit beside them. Suddenly, the argument didn't seem so important anymore. A local veterinary nurse who had assisted Dr. Walsh during Rudy's treatments shared her observations about the remarkable bond she had witnessed between patient and owner. In all my years working with animals and their families, I've rarely seen such a deep connection, she said. Rudy seemed to understand exactly what Ozzy needed at any given moment, and Ozzy responded to that dog with a tenderness that was beautiful to witness. Perhaps the most moving remembrance came from an unexpected source, Mrs. Eleanor Pemberton, an elderly woman from the village who had encountered Ozzy and Rudy during their daily walks. At 83, she had lived through enough loss to recognize genuine grief when she saw it, and she had been touched by the obvious love between the famous musician and his four-legged companion. I used to see them every morning, she said in her gentle voice. Rain or shine, there they be, walking through the village. That dog never left his side, and Mr. Osbourne always had time to stop and chat. He'd tell me about where they'd traveled together, and his whole face would light up when he talked about Rudy's latest adventure. You could see the love between them. It was pure and simple and real. That's a rare thing in this world. And We should all be grateful we had the chance to witness it. As the remembrances continued, it became clear that Rudy had affected far more people than anyone had realized. There were stories from hotel staff in cities around